All right, so if you remember from the last time I spoke back in February when there was all a bunch of snow on the ground, we left off at Genesis chapter 5. So today we can start with Genesis chapter 6. Yeah. Good, good. I'm glad because I'll be referencing it constantly and you'll have to remember all the details, what I said last time. Yeah, all right. So just for those of us who don't have such good memories, I'll give a brief recap. So we started off with God creating the world, and when he created it, it was very good. Then, of course, Adam and Eve sin, and they were created to be in the image of God, but they sin by and in their sin, they're trying to be like God. So it's kind of ironic. They try to be like God, knowing good and evil, and as we see in their lives, and then in the life of Cain, they are not able to reject the evil and choose the good. They're not able to make that distinction and figure out what is really good for them to do. And so they end up doing evil. And you can see in the life of Cain's family as it goes down the generations. It seems like they're doing very good, at least from a worldly perspective. They are very successful. They have art and music and science and technology and all this stuff is going for them. But they also have not much of a sense of morality. And we saw Lamech, who's the seventh person from Adam, like if you count the generations. Lamech is the seventh person from Adam through Cain. He's the guy who takes two wives and then he commits murder and then he brags about it to his wives and says, if God was going to avenge Cain sevenfold, then Lamech will avenge himself 77-fold. So he was saying, like, I can do better than God. I can one up God. He said that he would protect Cain's life by avenging him sevenfold. Well, I'm going to protect my own life 77-fold, even more thoroughly than God can. So you can see that rebellion against God. Even though Cain seems to be doing well, he has a city that he's built. He named it after his son. He has this legacy, but it's a legacy of sin. So it looks good on the outside, but there's a problem underneath. Then Adam and Eve have another son and name him Seth because God has appointed. The name means appointed. And Eve said, because God has appointed to me another son instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And in chapter 5, we saw the genealogy of Adam. And we learn about the legacy of Adam. So everyone in Adam's family dies. And it says very explicitly, and he died, and he died, and he died over and over again. Like it doesn't need to say that. It could just say, he lived this many years and then just move on. But it says, and he died, and he died, and he died, except for one time in Enoch, who's again the seventh person from Adam, but this time through Seth. It doesn't say, and he died. Instead, it says that Enoch walked with God, and he was not because God took him. So Enoch somehow escapes this legacy of death, and the way that he does it is by walking with God. Well, what does it mean to walk with God? That's what we'll find out a little bit more in these coming chapters in the life of Noah, and then ultimately later on, if you kept going through the book of Genesis, you'd find out a lot about this in the life of Abraham and his children, and we learn what it means to walk with God. So in Genesis chapter 6, it starts out with God making some observations about humanity. So Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit will not always strive with man, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So you have this story here about the sons of God and the daughters of men. And if you're expecting me to explain to you what that means, I'm sorry. There's different interpretations of that. I think, though, that I might not be able to interpret for you what exactly this story is talking about, but what I can say is what the significance of this is for the the larger narrative. So we have here two observations. At first, it talks for 2 verses about the sons of God and the daughters of men and having children. And then we have God looking down at humanity in verse 3. And then it talks about the descendants of these unions in verse 4. And then once again, we have God looking down at humanity and saying that they're wicked. So there's a contrast that's being made here. And you see that there's a lot of freedom that humanity has and a lot of power, right? It calls it says there's mighty men, men of renown. In Hebrew, the phrase is men of the name. And making a name for yourself is going to be a little bit of a theme in the coming chapters. So these are men who made a name for themselves. They were mighty men. They were powerful. Again, like the descendants of Cain, they look good on the outside, but there's a serious problem as God looks down on them and he sees that they're sinful. And we see that God is going to start to place limits on humanity. He says his days shall be 120 years. That's either a reference to the flood or a reference to God shortening people's lifespan. So God is going to start reigning in humanity. And that's something we'll see in these coming chapters. He's going to put limits on them because when God let them go without limits, right? Really long lifespans. They're all unified, right? There's no nations. They're all one people, all the same language. They're really powerful. All this freedom. And what are they using it for? They're using it to rebel against God and to sin and to hurt people. So sometimes you hear people say out in the world, "Oh, if we could only, get rid of all our differences and all be united together and all have enough education or whatever, that then humanity would finally flourish and we'd get rid of all of these problems that we're facing." But that is not what the Bible has to say about this. The Bible says the more power we have, the more freedom we have, even the more unified we are, the more we use that freedom to do evil. So the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And in case we get too high and mighty here for a second, remember, this is talking about all of us. It's talking about us as well. Every intent of the thoughts of my heart is only evil continually. And the Lord was grieved in his heart. Now, the language in verse 6, when it says the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart, the words that are used there in Hebrew, it's not very clear in the English, but in Hebrew, the words that are used there are the same as the ones that Lamech uses in the previous chapter. So Lamech names his son Noah. The name Noah means comfort. And Lamech says, "This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." So the 3 words are comfort, work, and toil. So then the Lord says that he is sorry. And the word here, it's the same word for comfort. It's a kind of generic word. That he had worked man on the earth and he was toiled in his heart. That's kind of a rough English translation, but it's the same 3 words there. So Lamech is concerned about the working the ground and all of this physical labor. The Lord is concerned about the state of humanity and the state of sin. So he says in verse 7, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So Noah is another man who walks with God, and in Noah's life, we'll get to see a little bit about what that looks like. So, verse 11, "The earth also was corrupt before the Lord, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth." So humanity is corrupting the earth by doing violence on it. And God said to Noah in verse 13, "The end of all flesh has come before me." So you could see God on his throne, and the end of all flesh has come before me. "For the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." And they've destroyed the earth. God is now going to destroy them from the earth. But God says to Noah, make yourself an ark. And he gives him instructions for how to build this ark. And then he says in verse 17, and behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, which is in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth will die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring two of every sort onto the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. And in verse 22 we read, Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did. So Noah hears God's command and he obeys. Right? He has faith that what God has said is actually going to happen, and he acts on that faith in obedience. So his obedience demonstrates his faith. And then in chapter 7, verse 1, the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. So there's two things that we've read that have come before the Lord. On the one hand, he says, the end of all flesh has come before me. Then we also have Noah, and Noah says, before you are righteous before me. So God sees the wickedness of humanity, but he also sees the righteousness of Noah, and he's pleased with Noah. So this is a prefiguring of Christ, the way that God sees Jesus' righteousness, and also, of course, the wickedness of the world. So God sees Noah, and Noah, he's pleased with what he sees because he is righteous. And he commands him to take all these animals and bring them into the ark. Right, so in verse 1, it's come into the ark. And then in verse 4, he says, for after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth, and he will destroy everything that he's made. And in verse 5, we read, Noah did according to all that God commanded him. So that's that same thing emphasized again. Noah did everything God told him to do. And he brings everything into the ark. And it says in verse 10, after 7 days, the waters of the flood were on the earth. So just like God said, after 7 days, the waters of the flood were going to come. In verse 11, we read, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So remember back from chapter 1, the earth started out, it was covered in the deep. And on days 2 and 3 of creation, God separated out the waters. First, he separated waters below from the waters above, and he put the sky in between them. And then he pulled the land out of the sea, and he separated those and made a place where people could live. Now all of those separations that God made during the original creation are being done away with. So the great deep is coming back. The windows of heaven are open. The waters are coming down now, are raining down on the earth. And just like humanity has been just working chaos in the moral realm, right? They're doing just whatever they want, making no distinction between good and evil. Now they're going to live in a world where God is also just allowing the world to be filled with chaos and destruction. So it's going to reflect the way that they are living their own lives. So the world is being unmade, and we read in verse 12, the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And then in verse 13 says, on the very same day, Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered the ark. Now, that's a very interesting thing that we just read. It says on the very same day. Why do you think it emphasizes that so much? That it was on the very same day that the rain came that Noah entered the ark. If we remember back to God's command, God told Noah in verse 1 to go into the ark, and he told them this from verse 4, 7 days before the rain was going to come. God told Noah to get into the ark. And we even read that Noah did according to all that God commanded him. But now, in verse 13, we read that Noah entered the ark on the very same day that it started raining. So that implies that he didn't obey God right away. He did obey God eventually, but there seems to be a delay between when God commanded him to go into the ark and when he actually entered the ark. Now, some secular scholars will say that this is a contradiction in the story, that Noah entered the ark twice in the story, and that's because this is just a bunch of a bunch of different stories that were mashed together, and they didn't do a careful job editing or something like that. Of course, that's not what we believe, and in fact, there's a very good reason why this story is put this way. This is not the only story in the book of Genesis where this kind of a thing happens, where God tells someone to do something, especially tells someone to go somewhere, and they don't obey right away. So some other examples are probably Abraham, because we read that Terah took Abraham and they were on their way to the lands of Canaan, and then they stop in the city of Haran, which is not in the land of Canaan, and they stay there until Terah dies, and it's only then that Abraham finally completes his journey and goes to Canaan. So we don't know when exactly God gave Abraham the call to go to Canaan, but it seems like he may have stopped over in Haran for a little bit of time before finally obeying God and going all the way. Another example, of course, is Lot. Lot is told to leave Sodom and Gomorrah, and he delays, he drags his feet, and God, the angels have to really drag him out of the city in order to get him to leave. And there's a lot of parallels between Lot and Noah, so this is one of them, the delayed obedience. Another one is Jacob. God tells Jacob to return to his family, and Jacob goes, and he even tells Esau that he's going to be right behind him, and then he stops off in Shechem, and he buys land there, and he apparently has no intention of finishing the journey and returning to his family. Of course, some bad things happen to him in Shechem, and then eventually he does obey God and return to Isaac, but only after this long delay. So you could see that there's this issue that people are having throughout the book of Genesis with delayed obedience. But why does the text then say that Noah did according to all that God commanded him? This is another thing that you see a lot in the book of Genesis, and it's especially striking with in chapter probably 26. Yeah, chapter 26. God is speaking to Isaac in that chapter. He tells Isaac, Abraham did everything that I commanded him. He obeyed me in everything. He always did what was right. And then the very next story is Isaac lies to Abimelech about his wife and says, my wife is my sister, which is exactly the same kind of sin that Abraham had committed earlier. So we see that there's a tension between God saying, Abraham always obeyed me, but then actually, well, Abraham didn't always do the right thing. He disobeyed. So how can God view Abraham as righteous? How can God view Noah as righteous? This is a bit of a question that gets posed for us by the book of Genesis. Of course, we know the answer because we have the answer key from the New Testament. But that's just an interesting thing to note here. So Noah is not himself perfect, it seems, but he does eventually obey. And it says, we read that God is pleased with Noah. So the waters come and everything that's alive is destroyed. This is described in great detail. It's a very graphic story. And then Noah is in chapter 8, that the rain finally stops. And we read in verse 1 that God remembered Noah. And in verse 2, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped. So now God is once again going to put the deep back in its place. He's going to recreate the world in a sense and repopulate it with living creatures, just like he did the first time around. It takes a while, so Noah is waiting and waiting. He sends out these birds, and he really waits a long time. So in verse 5, the waters were decreasing until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, the first day of the month, that's when the tops of the mountains were seen. And then in verse 6, 40 days later, Noah opens the window on top of the ark, and then he sends out the raven. And then he waits some more, sends out a dove. and the dove finds no resting place. And then he waits another 7 days in verse 10, and he sends the dove out again. So the time is really adding up here, 40 days, 7 days, 7 days. And then in verse 12, he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove again. And this time the dove doesn't return. And then we read in verse 13, it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters had dried up from the earth. So this is now, it was the 10th month earlier. So this is now 2 months that have passed here. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. So Noah's been doing all these things, sending out the birds, taking a look for himself to see whether it's safe or not yet. But he still hasn't left the ark. It's been 2 months. He's been waiting. Now we read in verse 14, in the second month. So this is now a whole other month. In the 27th day of the month. So it's actually almost the end of that month. So this is like 2 months later. I guess that's like 4 months after the tops of the mountains were seen. Finally, Noah is going to be able to leave the ark because in verse 15, God spoke to Noah saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you, and bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you. And he says, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So in verse 18, Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with them, and all the animals go out according to their families. So God finally called Noah out of the ark, and it was God is the one who told Noah that it was safe. So none of the things that Noah did ultimately ended up being necessary because God brought him out when it was time. So there's a lesson here about patience and waiting on the Lord. He knows when the best time is, and he always remembers us, like we read in verse 1 of this chapter. So in verse 20, Noah built an altar to the Lord, and he takes all these animals and offers them. And it says in verse 21, the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Now, the name Noah means comfort, and that Hebrew word meaning comfort is the same word that's used here, just a different form to mean soothing. So there's a lot of wordplay on the name Noah throughout this whole story. And this is one of the instances of that. The Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Now, what is it about this sacrifice? What is it about this worship that pleased the Lord? You remember earlier we saw Cain attempting to worship the Lord, and the Lord was not pleased with Cain's sacrifice. Why was God not pleased with Cain's sacrifice? Well, he actually tells Cain, he appears to him and says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? If you do what is good, will you not be accepted? So God did not accept Cain's worship because he wasn't doing what was right. Now we see God is pleased with Noah's sacrifice. And why is he pleased with Noah's sacrifice? Well, it's because he's pleased with Noah himself. God has seen Noah, seen that he's righteous, and God is pleased with him. So Noah builds the altar, and God accepts his worship because he's pleased with him. And it says the Lord smelled a soothing aroma, a Noah-ing aroma. And the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. So the Lord, this is the third time the Lord has cursed the grounds. The first was with Adam. The second was with Cain. And the third time is when when the Lord destroys everyone from the earth with the flood. Now God says, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake. So Noah has fulfilled the prophecy of his father Lamech. Remember, Lamech said, this one will comfort us concerning our work, the toil, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. Now God is pleased with Noah, and so he says, I will never again curse the ground. So if we've been reading the book of Genesis up to this point, and if we didn't know anything about the rest of scriptures, maybe we would expect Noah is finally going to be the one to crush the serpent's head that we read about in chapter 3. He is going to bring victory over sin. The world has now been remade. It's a fresh start. We're starting over. Everything is going to be great now, and Noah has brought deliverance. But unfortunately, we're going to see that Noah is going to repeat some of the mistakes of his ancestor Adam. So, but here we don't know that yet. So we still think that everything is great. So God says in verse 22 of chapter 8, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So this is the promise of the very first covenant that God makes in the Bible, the Noahic covenant that God is about to make with Noah. So in verse 1 of chapter 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So again, this is a restart. This is a recreation of the world. We get that blessing again that God gave to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And he says, the fear of you, the dread of you will be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and on the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. So once again, God gives humanity dominion, rulership over everything. And he also provides food for him. So during the first creation story, God said, see, I have given you every green herb. And now he says in verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. So again, this is a reset, and God is repeating a lot of the things from that original creation story. He warns in verse 4, things are going to be a little different this time in verses 4 and 5. You shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely for your lifeblood, I will demand a reckoning. From the hands of every beast I will require it, and from the hands of man, from the hands of every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful, multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply on it. So the change now that we're going to see moving forward is God is going to start placing more limitations on humanity. So remember, after Cain killed Abel, God showed mercy to him. He didn't do what Cain deserved. What did Cain deserve for killing Abel? He deserved to die. But God showed mercy to him, and we see that Cain's descendants use the freedom that God had given him. They take God's mercy and they use it as an excuse to do even more evil. So Lamech isn't afraid to kill someone, and he even boasts about it to his wives. So God is going to now say that things are going to be different this time around. And then in verse 8, verse 9, he tells Noah that he is going to establish his covenant with him and with his descendants after him. And in verse 11, the covenant is, never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And then God gives a sign of the covenant in verse 12. And in verse 13, the sign is, I set my bow in the cloud. So in Hebrew, just like in English, the word bow can mean like a rainbow, or it can also mean like the weapon that shoots arrows. So it's like God taking his bow, his weapon of war, and he's hanging it up in the clouds to see that he's not going to be going to war with humanity. So I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And it shall be when I bring the cloud on the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the face of the earth. And you can see there's a lot of repetition in that. It's really important driving that point home. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. And verse 18, the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was dispersed. And we're getting a little bit of a hint here about what's coming in the future chapters of the word dispersed in verse 19. Then in verse 20, we get the first real sign that something is going to happen just the way that it happened before. Now, again, this is something that's not very clear in an English translation. So in the English translation, it says Noah began to be a farmer. But translating it a little bit more literally, it's Noah began to be a man of the ground. Now, the Hebrew word ground here is the word Adamah. It's the red dirt, the clay that God used to make Adam. Remember, he was called Adam because he was made from the Adamah. So and Adam was a man of dust, right? He was a man of the ground, made from the ground. And so here we read Noah began to be a man of the Adamah. And he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. So just like his ancestor Adam, Noah consumes the fruit and his nakedness is exposed. And Ham comes in and there's this whole story where Noah ends up cursing his grandson Canaan. So just like within Adam's family, where Adam's children were under a curse, right? Cain was cursed by the Lord. Adam was exposed. Noah is exposed. And we see that Noah is not really fundamentally different from Adam. He's a man of the earth. Just like Adam, he's still subject to the same weaknesses, and his family is subject to the same weaknesses. This is the first in a little bit of a repeating theme throughout Genesis of children taking advantage of their parents in some way or abusing their parents. So you see that family unity that God ordained when he first created Adam and Eve to be one flesh is not functioning the way that it should in Noah's family. So that unity is broken. And we read in verses 28 and 29, Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So Noah has not escaped the legacy of death from Adam. Well, then in chapter 10, we get the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And this chapter is often called the Table of Nations because all these children, the names of many of these children are the names of great, powerful nations that were around the children of Israel. There's 70 nations that are listed in this chapter. And in the middle of this chapter, we read about Nimrod, and it says in verse 9 that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And then it talks about all these powerful cities that he built. So he's a city builder. Cain was the first person who built a city. Nimrod is also building a city. He's a mighty hunter. He's a famous hunter. He's a mighty man who's made a name for himself. But this is all we're going to read about him, because the book of Genesis is not going to be really concerned so much about Nimrod or any of these other great and powerful nations. You know, if you were writing a history of the world, what would you want to write about? Most people write about the big nations and the battles and the kings and the power. But that's not how God wrote his history of the world. We get this list of these 70 nations here, and then we're going to get the story of the Tower of Babel, and then we're going to be pretty much done with the nations, and we'll move on to Abraham and his children. Now, there's 70 nations that are listed in this chapter 10. When Jacob goes to the land of Egypt with his family, there's 70 descendants of Jacob who go to Egypt from the lands of Canaan. And we read in the book of Deuteronomy, this fact is pointed out, this parallel, 70 nations and the 70 children of Jacob who went down to Canaan. And in Deuteronomy, it says, you set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. So God thinks that this family, this children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God thinks that they're really important, and he puts them on the same level. Actually, he puts them really higher than all of the nations in this list here. So the book of Genesis starts out with a list of 70 nations, but it ends with the list of the sons of Jacob, the 70 sons of Jacob who go to Egypt. But so the nations will still get their one story. That's in chapter 11. So we'll learn a little bit about the nations. Now, if we've been following the story so far, it's actually been following a very familiar pattern. So remember, the flood was kind of like a reset. The world was recreated, and we saw a lot of the blessings from the creation story reappearing in Noah's family. But then we saw Noah fell in a way that parallels a lot the story of Adam's fall and how he ate the fruit and was exposed. And we read about his children, just like Adam's children being under a curse. And just like we got Adam's genealogy right after the story of Cain, we got this genealogy. We also got here the genealogy of Noah's children. So what comes next? The next story after Adam's genealogy was God looking down at the people, the mighty descendants of the sons of God, and saying the earth is God being sorry that he had made man on the earth, because every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's what happened last time. Now in chapter 11, we're going to see God coming down and looking once again at the children of man. So chapter 11, verse 1, the whole earth had one language and one speech. Well, that's not going to last very long. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now, journeying from the east is this, it happens a lot so far. Adam and Eve were cast out on the east side of Eden. Then their son Cain also is said to go east of Eden. So the whole earth is going east once again. And they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And in verse 3, they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So they're trying to make a name for themselves, just like those people of old, the men of the name that we read about earlier. They also want to be famous. And in verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." Now, what's the problem with that? It sounds like a kind of nice thing. I was actually talking to someone who's a relatively new believer, and he's been reading the book of Genesis, and he was like, "Oh yeah," when I saw that, I was like, "Oh, that's kind of nice." So all humanity is united. Nothing that they propose to do is withheld from them. We can do anything when we work together. You know, that sounds like a very positive message. What's the problem? The problem is we know what happens when nothing that they propose to do is withheld from them, because we saw earlier that every intent of the thoughts of man's heart is only evil continually. Every intent of the thoughts of our heart is only evil continually. And so God is going to step in this time, and he's going to prevent it. He has a solution that's going to restrain humanity and hold back the amount of evil that they're capable of doing. And his solution is really, you gotta love how elegant it is. All God has to do is, verse 7, "Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." That's all that God has to do in order to get humanity to be divided and incapable of working together. You know, it doesn't take that long to learn a language. It's hard, but it's not an insurmountable obstacle. But that's all God needed to do, and then sin nature took over from there. And even to this day, we've been fighting with one another, and there's all these different nations, and we read throughout the scriptures how God controls the nations. He sets their boundaries, and eventually they're all going to unite once again. And that'll be, what happens towards the ends of the world, and God will finally come and defeat the nations as they come together against him. But here, God has placed some limitations on humanity. So things are not going to go exactly the same way as they went the last time when God had to send the flood to destroy everyone. And so verse 8, God scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. There's some wordplay here. The word for confused is Balel. So Babel, Balel. God confused their language and scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Right? And then we get the genealogy of Shem that's going to lead right down to Abram. And so we'll see what it is that God is doing differently this time. So he's bought himself some time, right, by separating all these nations. Now, what is God going to do that is going to prevent things from going just exactly the same way they went the first time when he had to destroy the earth with a flood? So just like God chose Noah that time, he's going to choose Abram this time. That's what we can read about during the next meeting. So let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for your word and for all that we can learn from it. I thank you for the way that you've had mercy on us, even though we're evil people and every intent of the thoughts of our heart is only evil continually. I thank you for your son, the goodness that he showed to us and the way you've been working in us to change us to be more like him. So please guide us as we learn from your word. And I thank you for your great salvation, which you can see even from the very beginning of Scripture, how you have shown mercy to us and have rescued us out from judgment and death. So I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.